Welcome back to another episode of Wine About Data. My name is Amanda Lopez. I'm president at Transform Consulting Group. And today I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Rose Johnson, senior project consultant here. Rose, share a little bit about yourself, your role at TCG, and even some of your prior experience before coming to TCG.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Amanda, so much for having me. As Amanda shared, I'm a senior product consultant with Transform Consulting Group. Really excited to be back on today's podcast. And I really bring a background in nonprofit management to this role, both in direct service programming with youth development organizations, but also with fundraising and grant writing. And so, coming into TCG, it's really great to bring both of those experiences. And then I love data. I'm a guilty data nerd. So bringing in data analysis to make programs and fundraising really successful is something I'm passionate about. So really excited to dig into that today.
Great. I'm glad that you're back with us, Rose, and look forward to digging into our topic of how to use data in grant writing, which I know is a huge topic and pain point for our listeners. But before we dive in to our episode here, let's talk about our wine and what we're drinking today, Rose. So we have this beautiful Chardonnay from Baroda Founders Wine Cellar. And have you ever been up to Southwest Michigan, Rose?
I have, but I've never been to a winery in the area. I know.
I feel like my listeners have heard this so many times because I keep bragging about it, but I'm a big fan of Lake Michigan, and the Southwest region is this perfect place to grow grapes. So there's all of these beautiful wineries, and I've been spending my time with my husband and our friends going up there. So if you haven't checked out this winery or in that region, we encourage you to go. But let's try it and see what we think of this wine. Cheers.
Cheers.
What do you think?
It's good. I like it.
Yeah. Now, you said you like a drier wine.
Dry. Yeah.
So a Chardonnay, I think, is a good drier kind of wine. There's some that are buttery.
Yeah.
Some oaky. Yeah. This isn't an oaky wine.
No.
Yeah. Real smooth.
It's easy. Yeah. Easy drink it. It's good.
Well, as we're heading into summer season, this is a good one to, enjoy out at a lake or a backyard. But we want you to join us with whatever you're drinking, whatever your, favorite drink is, a coffee, a sparkling water, whatever that might be. Yeah. So let's get into our topic today and what we're whining about. So as I mentioned already, today's conversation is about using data in grant writing. And we're going to talk about data, how data needs to be a part of your story and actual grant applications, and really how to make the process more efficient. Because we know that resources are stretched and it can take a lot of work and energy into writing grants. And there isn't a high success rate. So we want to position our grantees the best to be able to be successful. So let's first throw out some data for you. So we know that nonprofits typically have a variety of funding sources that they can use, and about 20% or 1/5 of their funding comes from grants. Now, your nonprofit may be more grant heavy or less grant heavy. And really, as we like to talk about when it comes to funding for nonprofits, it's all about your goals. What do you want to accomplish? And then depending on what you're wanting to accomplish, grow your programs, expand your reach, build on, add a facility, fund staff or operations, do training. Your funding source should match that. So, Rose, when are grants a good use for a nonprofit?
Yeah, it's a good question, Amanda, because they're not always a good fit, right? And so I would say, as a general rule of thumb, grants are a really great choice when you're a good fit for what the funder is looking for. So they can be limiting, they can be restrictive. And so knowing that right off the bat is really important. I think grants especially can be good when you're doing something new or something innovative. A lot of grant makers are looking for that new thing, right? That new program that has the potential to expand. So that's a really good time. Speaking of expansion, when you are expanding, when you're going into a new community or taking a proven model and expanding that in some way, that can also be a really good time for grants. In general, grants can be less strong options for really reliable, ongoing operational funding. Right. So a lot of grants don't want to fund overhead as much. They don't necessarily want to fund staffing unless it's program focused. And a lot of grants aren't multi-year. Many, you're having to apply over and over again. So in general, just balancing, the time that you're putting in with the potential reward based on your fit is a really great rule of thumb.
Right. Absolutely. So there's definitely pros of having grants and going after the grant funding. But as we mentioned, it can be a lot of work. So we want to make sure that you have the right fit. And like Rose said, I like to say, no funder wants to adopt you forever. So it's not going to be that dedicated source of funding that you can just automatically rely on and have. And I think the other thing I think about with grants is there's often a lot of strings, meaning they can be pretty restrictive of how you're using those funds. And so sometimes there's not, again, the best use of funding. But we do see a lot of value in grants, and we work with a lot of clients to help them apply for grants and evaluate their grants and do some prep work in finding grant funding. So let's get into some of those, tips and strategies, Rose, around, when is it the right time to go after a grant? And I'll also kind of position this to say you've done a lot of trainings on grant writing as well. And so helping to share some of those lessons learned and best practices. So share some of those insights that you share in the trainings for our listeners.
Absolutely. Well, I think my favorite thing that we talk about when we do talk about grant writing and how to prepare for success is knowing your audience, how important it is to do that work in advance before you even start the grant application, to get to know your funders. And I say that, both through data and through conversation. And so doing your research, knowing what they're looking for and what that fit is going to be is really critical. And if possible, talking with them. I think we had an organization that we had the opportunity to work with, and they had some really great success in getting grants, and they were trying to move that to the next level. They were trying to get more successful. And one of the main things that they weren't yet doing was a huge missed opportunity was just building relationships with their grant funders, the same way they would do with a major gift donor, and having those in-depth conversations with them. And so I think once an organization starts putting that into their practice, it takes them to that next level.
That's right. I think that's a really great point. And so a lot of foundations, I think of like those private foundations, family, corporate, community foundations, they're very relational with nonprofits. And I know for many nonprofits, it can feel intimidating, to be able to talk to them, or you might think that's like a conflict of interest, but that's typically not the case. And so we typically recommend that before you even submit or apply, that you pick up the phone and you have a conversation with that potential funder.
Absolutely. And 9 times out of 10, they're going to be open to that. If for whatever reason you can't get that conversation, you have some wonderful resources available to you online as well to do research on that funder. So use your resources to get to know them and what they like to fund before you apply.
Yep, absolutely. And I think finding some data. So pulling those foundations 990s is a wealth of knowledge and information to look at what have been their giving levels and who have they funded.
Absolutely. Foundation Directory Online is a really great tool. If you haven't already, check your local library. Most libraries have free access. You can do a lot of great research on there as well.
Yep. I would say just the type of grants that we don't typically recommend, or you have the opportunity to build a relationship, tend to be government grants. So they are a lot more restrictive in their process and really following that, and typically don't have an opportunity to ask questions beyond just basic questions about the RFP.
That's true. Yeah. And I think in those cases, your best friend is the RFP, actually. Really
study it.
Thoroughly read that resource and ask yourself all along, are we fitting the things that they're looking for before you invest the time?
Right. Absolutely. Because those can be even more restrictive of both in the application process and then actually what you can fund with those grant funding opportunities. And I would say too, and the uncertainties of this year in 2025, there's been a lot of changes in government funding, and we're not saying don't go after it, but also, let's not put all of our eggs in one basket. And I would say that's the big takeaway that we often tell our nonprofits is that you don't want to be too heavy on one funding source. Right? It's important that you do have diversity. You don't need to have all the different types of funding opportunity, but there's, as we talked earlier, there's pros and cons, right? If you only have grant funding, it can be restrictive and a lot of work. So, make sure that you are trying to balance out those grant funds. Well, Rose, let's transition to the next topic and say, okay, now we've, done our due diligence, right? We found the funder that we think is a good fit. We looked at the grant applications. We think it's a good fit, or we know funders that we want to pursue, cultivate those relationships. What kind of prep work can nonprofits do especially when it relates to data, which is an essential part to get ready for grant opportunities?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because I truly believe a lot of the work can be done in advance. It doesn't have to be done right when that RFP comes out and it's due in a week. You're scrambling, right? We've all been there as a grant writer. I've been there. But you can do a lot of that in advance. One of my favorite things, that I love to recommend is building a data inventory. I know we always recommend that our clients do that. And when I say data inventory, I really mean a list, really, of your go-to data indicators and where to find that information. And so the public data that helps you to demonstrate your need, right? Those key data indicators that you find you're going back to that show why what you are doing is so needed, the scope of the need in your community and how it's changed over time. Putting those in a list and having the indicator, the source, how often it's updated, information like that in one place is so critical. And then pairing that with your internal information from your organization as well. What are those key success metrics that you want to always be sharing in grant applications? Having that all in one place, whether it's a spreadsheet or a doc even, one go-to place for all your key data indicators is huge.
Yeah.
And then the other piece that I would say is creating a really strong case statement for your organization and a program summary as well. So a case statement, being really the story of your organization, why you exist, making the case that you have the solution to the problem or the need that you're trying to solve, and integrating data into that story.
Right.
And so if you're curious about more on that, refer back to the data storytelling episode.
Yeah.
And then program summaries, if you have a lot of different programs and you're applying to program specific grants, having a version of that story that's program specific as well.
Wow, Rose, I feel like you just data dumped a lot of nuggets there. So let me try to unpack some of those helpful tips and strategies for our listeners. So I think the first thing that you talked about is a data inventory, which is great because a lot of times, sometimes in a nonprofit, there's one team member maybe on the resource development team that's writing all the grants, right? And then there might be another team member that's program. And so they're having to get information from all these different sources, because you wore those hats, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of that I think you talked about was getting external data, that community public data. And I think listeners might be surprised by that because we often think a grant application is just talking about our own program and services. So at first I wanted to understand, why is that valuable and how would you use some of that community data?
Absolutely. Well, I think you mentioned, the average win rate for grants is between 10 and 30%. And so, far less than half of the applicants are getting a grant at any one time. And so you want to stand out. And pulling in public data to really show that funder how critical the need is that you're serving can help you to really stand out from the crowd. And so, in that way, you're positioning yourself as the expert in that community need.
Yeah.
You know what the need is in your community. You know the scope of it, how it's changed.
Right.
And then you bring in your program impact data to show that you have the solution. And you really need both of those to tell a good story.
Yeah, I love that positioning. And when we talk about that, working with our clients on some of these projects, I think it sounds intimidating, but it really helps to go back to your why. And that's what the funder wants to understand, right? So if you're a tutoring program and you're helping, students learn to read or get on grade level with reading, then what's the need in the community about literacy and reading, right? And then how many students are you serving? And how much are you closing that reading gap? And then what's the unmet need? And that unmet need is where you come in. That nonprofit comes in and says, this is why we're here. We need more money to serve more students, or we need money to help enhance our programming so we can better close the gap, right? And so that's that data storytelling because it helps to provide context. I think sometimes too, a nonprofit, we're so knowledgeable that we forget, that funder is a lay person. They're not the expert in your industry or sector.
Oftentimes.
Right. And I feel like those grants, we have to spell it out. And often when we're writing them or getting information from our clients, we're like, we need more details. Talk to me like I know nothing, because that's how most funders are when they're reading it. And they want to have all the information and actual data, not just a few data points and indicators to back that up.
Absolutely. Don't make assumptions about your funders, and know that oftentimes it may not be the person you talk to who's reviewing that application.
Right.
It could be a committee.
Yeah.
It could be others. And so you want that story to resonate with anybody who has a voice in making that funding decision.
If they're reading about your organization or your program for the first time,
yes,
that's what you have to assume. They know nothing about your industry, your organization, your community. And so to have it all spelled out there is really important. Well, Rose, you mentioned a couple of other key tools that nonprofits could do to help prep for grants. So you said case statements and program summaries. And I know we have a couple of blogs about case statements.
You do.
And we have a good winning formula. But briefly highlight, what are the main components of a case statement?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a case statement, one, is a living document. So as you're building your case statement, start somewhere. You can always make additions and changes. But in general, it does start with kind of outlining the need. What is the need that you are serving? And then really goes to explaining and positioning why your organization is the organization to address that need.
Yeah.
And so it often brings in your history. It may bring in your track record of success. What are your program outcomes that show that you can solve that need?
Right.
It may bring in, describing your programs as well. What are your various solutions to that need? And really it closes with, what is that transformational success that you are trying to achieve?
What's the aspiration and then therefore the ask?
Yes.
Like where's the gap of what you want to do in the future and why you're seeking funds to help support the next steps.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you can see how data is really weaved throughout a case statement and telling that story.
Yes.
And then just briefly, what's the formula of a program summary?
Yeah, that's a good question, Amanda. Well, particularly for our larger organizations that might have several programs that might be pretty different.
Yeah.
If you're applying for a grant, a general case statement about your organization may not capture the story you're trying to tell. So a program summary gets more specific into that exact program, the specifics around who you're serving, the community, the program outcomes related to that program. So your track record of success and the program model itself. So, a really good, quick description of what that program is. And in general, a strong case statement or program summary, every grant is different, but it's going to give you a great starting point for that grant application.
Yeah. And I think that goes to efficiency, because sometimes we find out about grant opportunities really late or there's just not a lot of time and prep work. And so having some of this data, these stories, this information pulled together, and would you say update annually?
At least,
quarterly.
At least.
And again, the cycle of your programs. Yes. And so the cycle of when new data will become available. I know that we worked with a United Way organization and really helped them to create a formula for their program summaries of their different lines and focus areas. And so that was going to be a helpful tool because they had staff in different departments.
Yes.
And so they could have that prepped and ready. So either sharing it with a donor or a potential funder helps to kind of say, okay, here's an opportunity of where we're wanting to grow and expand.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's especially valuable, particularly in that example where you have a lean team. If you're a team of one or you're even a CEO or a development director and you're writing grants, these are your best friends.
Yes.
Having a data inventory and case statements, program summaries is going to help you to be more efficient.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Rose, you've shared a lot of great wisdom with us today and hopefully some practical solutions. So as we transition to closing out this episode, what would be that one, tip, one thing that you would hope our listeners could leave with and really start to apply?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is find your data. Just start making a list. Even go back to the grant applications you had from the last year maybe and start pulling in all the data indicators you used to start that data inventory. Because again, that can be a living document, but starting a list of those key data indicators in and of itself will save you a ton of time.
Those are all so helpful. And I hope, can take away some of the fear and the sense of being overwhelmed that we know a lot of our nonprofit friends are. So just to recap for our episode today, we really talked about the pros and cons of grant writing, right? And the challenge, it takes a lot of work and the success rate isn't high. Does that mean that we stop there? No, there's still a great opportunity and value in applying for grants. And hopefully we made the case of how data could really be a great way to position you successfully to be more successful in applying for grants and setting yourself apart from other organizations seeking out those funds. So hopefully we've given you some helpful tips of resources of where to get started, like Rose said, to break it down and make it more like easier for you as well as successful and fruitful.
Yeah.
So we appreciate everybody tuning in today in our episode of Wine About Data. If you haven't yet, we would love for you to rate our episode, give us a 5-star review, and share this episode with your friends and your contacts so that they would have one less thing to whine about. So stay tuned. We have a special guest joining us on our next episode, a friend of ours representing a community foundation, and she'll be talking about the importance of data for our philanthropic partners and for grantees. So I'm really looking forward to the perspective that she's going to bring and share with our winers. Well, Rose, cheers to you and the great work that you're doing on our team here at Transform Consulting Group.
Cheers, Amanda.
Thanks everybody. And we hope that we've given you one less thing to whine about.